His secretary was caught stealing company files. The truth shocked everyone. The easiest lie to believe is the one supported by perfect evidence. That was the thought echoing through my mind the night everything I had worked for began to collapse. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the executive floor of Brooks Global should have been completely empty. The cleaning crew had already finished. The elevators had switched to after-hours security mode. Even the city outside seemed quieter, its lights reflecting against the floor-to-ceiling windows that surrounded the headquarters 38 stories above Manhattan. I should never have been there. At least that was what everyone would say by sunrise. My employee badge unlocked the archive door with a soft electronic click, and I stepped into the restricted records room, carrying nothing except a company-issued encrypted drive and the growing weight of a decision I could no longer postpone. The room smelled faintly of polished steel and recycled air. Rows of secure storage cabinets lined the walls while silent servers blinked beneath soft white lights. Every movement felt louder than it should have. My heartbeat, my footsteps, even my breathing sounded like a confession. I connected the encrypted drive to the isolated workstation and entered the authorization sequence Daniel Mercer had taught me months earlier before he disappeared from the company without explanation. Folder after folder appeared across the monitor. Historical financial approvals, archived executive correspondence, internal audit revisions. I selected only the files that mattered, not because they were valuable, because they were disappearing. 1 week earlier, every document had still existed. Yesterday, 3 had vanished. Tonight, I was afraid the rest would follow. The transfer bar slowly climbed across the screen. 23%, 38, 51. My phone vibrated once inside my blazer pocket. No ringtone. No message preview. Only a single vibration from an unknown number. It had happened before. Every anonymous notification had been followed by another missing record somewhere inside the company's system. I looked at the screen for less than a second before slipping the phone back into my pocket. There was no time to think. Only time to finish. 78%. 84. Then the room exploded with flashing red lights. A piercing alarm shattered the silence as emergency strobes reflected across every metal surface. An automated voice calmly announced, "Unauthorized data transfer detected. Security response activated." My hands froze above the keyboard. Not because I had been caught, because I knew I had not finished in time. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway outside. The archive door unlocked automatically, and 2 security officers entered first, followed by another pair. None of them raised their voices. None of them needed to. Every monitor displayed the same unmistakable warning across the screen. Confidential company records copied without authorization. One officer carefully removed the encrypted drive while another requested my identification badge. I surrendered it without resistance. There was no point pretending innocence when the evidence appeared undeniable. Then another voice entered the room. Calm, controlled, familiar. Everyone waited outside. The security officers immediately stepped back. Nathan Sterling stood just inside the doorway, still wearing the charcoal suit from the board meeting earlier that afternoon. His tie had been loosened after what must have been another exhausting 16-hour day, but nothing else about him suggested fatigue. His gray eyes moved from the disconnected drive to the transfer screen before finally meeting mine. For 4 years I had managed every impossible schedule, every confidential meeting, every crisis that crossed his desk. He had trusted me with information capable of moving markets. Tonight, that trust vanished in complete silence. "Emily," he said quietly, "tell me I am not looking at what I think I am looking at." I wanted to answer. I wanted to tell him everything Daniel had discovered, every missing approval, every altered audit trail, every warning that had led me into this room. But the truth was larger than both of us, and speaking too soon would only give the wrong people time to erase what remained. I looked directly into his eyes, took one slow breath, and spoke the only sentence I knew would still matter tomorrow. "If these files disappear tonight," I whispered, "the truth disappears with them." Ethan did not answer immediately. His expression remained unreadable, but for the briefest moment uncertainty replaced certainty behind his eyes. Before either of us could say another word, the conference room doors at the end of the hallway opened and members of the executive board hurried toward the archive, their voices already filling the corridor with questions. By morning they would all believe they knew exactly what had happened. None of them realized they had only witnessed the beginning of a story someone had been trying to erase for years. The conference room felt colder than the rest of the building, even though the thermostat insisted it was 72 degrees. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the way everyone avoided looking directly at me, as if guilt could somehow spread through eye contact alone. My company identification card rested on the polished walnut table beside a printed incident report nearly an inch thick. For years of loyalty had been reduced to a stack of papers generated in less than 8 hours. I kept my hands folded in my lap because they were the only part of me I could still control. Across the table, Nathan Sterling read every page without rushing. He did not interrupt anyone. He did not defend me. He simply listened while the head of corporate security explained how the encrypted drive had been recovered, how the surveillance cameras showed me entering the archive room alone, and how the system logs confirmed I had copied restricted files without authorization. Every sentence sounded final. Every fact sounded impossible to argue against. When the presentation ended, one board member quietly asked whether I had anything to say before formal disciplinary proceedings began. I lifted my eyes and answered honestly. Everything in that report happened exactly as described. The room shifted with quiet surprise. Someone expected excuses. Someone expected tears. I offered neither. Then why? Another executive asked. Because if I answered that question today, I replied, the people responsible would have enough time to erase what still remains. Several people exchanged confused looks. One director sighed impatiently and muttered that I was only making my situation worse. Perhaps I was. But Daniel Mercer had warned me that the truth only survived if someone refused to surrender before the evidence could speak for itself. Ethan finally closed the report and looked directly at me. His expression remained calm, but I recognized something different behind it. Not trust. That had already been damaged. Curiosity. Everyone except Ms. Carter, he said quietly. The room hesitated before chairs slid backward and the executives slowly filed into the hallway. The door closed with a soft click, leaving only the two of us inside the room that had hosted hundreds of strategic meetings over the years. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Morning sunlight stretched across the conference table, illuminating tiny dust particles drifting through the air between us. You have never lied to me before, Ethan finally said. Not once. I lowered my eyes for a moment. I am still not lying. Then help me understand. His voice remained steady, free of anger, which somehow made the conversation even harder. I cannot explain everything yet, I answered carefully. But I never intended to harm this company. He leaned back slightly, studying me with the same measured focus he used during difficult negotiations. You expected to be caught. It was not a question. I nodded once. Yes. Because this was never about stealing. Again I nodded. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Someone wanted those records to disappear. I did not answer. Silence became my only protection. Ethan noticed. Instead of pressing harder, he stood and walked toward the glass wall overlooking Manhattan. The city below continued moving as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yellow taxis crossed intersections. Ferries glided across the river. Thousands of people hurried toward ordinary days while ours quietly unraveled. Daniel Mercer, Ethan said without turning around. My heartbeat stopped for half a second. He had spoken the one name I had protected for months. I found an expense approval with his digital signature yesterday, he continued. It had been archived under an inactive classification that should not have existed. I remained completely still. Did he tell you to copy those files? Ethan asked. I closed my eyes briefly before answering. Daniel never asked me to break company policy. That was true. But he did ask you to protect something. I looked up. For the first time since the alarm sounded the night before, I realized Ethan was no longer trying to prove I was guilty. He was trying to discover who wanted me to appear guilty. Before I could respond, his assistant knocked softly on the door and stepped inside carrying a sealed interoffice envelope without a return address. This was delivered to your office 20 minutes ago, she said. Ethan accepted it, thanked her, and waited until the door closed again. The envelope contained only a single sheet of paper. Across the center, printed in plain black letters, was one sentence. Stop looking before history disappears forever. Ethan slowly placed the page on the table between us. Neither of us spoke. We no longer needed to. For the first time since the archive alarm shattered the silence, we both understood that someone else had been watching every move we made, and the real story had only just begun. The sealed envelope remained on the conference table long after Ethan and I stopped speaking. The message inside was only one sentence, but it carried the weight of a warning from someone who knew exactly where we were looking and exactly what we were trying to find. Stop looking before history disappears forever. I had seen enough strange things inside Brooks Global over the past few months to understand that threats did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes they appeared as missing files, sometimes as altered records, sometimes as a quiet sentence printed on a blank page. Ethan picked up the envelope again and examined every detail. No company logo, no return address, no delivery information. Whoever sent it had bypassed the normal system completely. "How long have you known something was wrong?" he asked. I looked through the glass wall toward the city below. From that height, Manhattan looked organized and perfect, but I had learned that beautiful things could hide complicated stories. 3 months, I answered. Ethan's expression changed slightly. 3 months, and you said nothing? The disappointment in his voice was harder to hear than anger would have been. I tried, I said quietly. But every time I followed a lead, the evidence changed. A report would be corrected. An approval would disappear. A record would suddenly have a different timestamp. I paused before continuing. Someone inside the company knew how to clean up their tracks. Ethan placed the envelope down carefully, and Daniel Mercer discovered it. I nodded. Daniel had been the chief financial officer of Brooks Global for 12 years. He was the person everyone trusted when numbers became complicated and decisions became difficult. He was also the person who disappeared after submitting an internal audit request that was never completed. Officially, he resigned for personal reasons. Unofficially, nobody could explain why a man who dedicated his entire career to the company would leave without saying goodbye to the people who worked beside him. He contacted me the night before he vanished. I said. He told me there were inconsistencies in the financial records. Small changes that looked meaningless individually, but together they showed a pattern. Ethan walked back toward the table. What pattern? I opened my laptop and showed him a file I had saved separately from the company network. A timeline appeared on the screen. Different transactions, different departments, different approval dates. Someone was moving information through multiple channels so no single department would notice. They were not taking large amounts at once. They were creating confusion. Ethan studied the screen in silence. The executive who usually had an answer for every problem suddenly looked like someone seeing a familiar place from a completely different perspective. "Why did you not bring this to me?" he asked. I hesitated. This was the hardest part to explain. Because Daniel tried. The room became quiet. He brought concerns to senior leadership before he contacted me. After that meeting, the records started changing faster. Then he disappeared from the company. Ethan looked away for a moment. I could see the conflict behind his expression. He wanted to reject the possibility that someone close to him had betrayed the company. But facts did not care about comfort. They only waited to be discovered. "Who else knows about this?" he asked. "Very few people." "Names?" I looked at him carefully. "That is the problem. We do not know who we can trust." For the first time, Ethan did not respond like a CEO managing a crisis. He responded like someone searching for the truth. He closed my laptop and handed it back to me. "From this moment forward, we verify everything." His voice was calm, but different from before. No assumptions. No shortcuts. I nodded. Then his phone received a notification. He checked the screen, and his expression changed. "What is it?" I asked. He turned the phone toward me. A new email had arrived from an internal account that should have been inactive for months. The sender name was Daniel Mercer. The message contained only one line. I left the answer where nobody thought to look. Ethan and I looked at each other. The mystery inside Brooks Global was no longer about stolen files. It was about a truth someone had spent years trying to bury. The name on the email screen felt impossible. Daniel Mercer. Not a forwarded message. Not an old document. A direct message from an account that should have been closed months ago. Nathan Sterling stared at the screen without moving, as if the answer he had been searching for was sitting right in front of him, but he was not ready to accept what it meant. I understood that feeling. Sometimes the truth does not arrive like a revelation. Sometimes it arrives quietly, forcing you to question everything you believed before. Ethan opened the email carefully. There was no attachment, no explanation, Only a short sentence beneath the sender information. I left the answer where nobody thought to look. He read it twice before looking at me. Did Daniel ever mention a location? I shook my head slowly. No. He was careful. He never gave me complete information. Why? Ethan asked. Because he knew someone was watching. Those words changed the atmosphere in the room. Until that moment, Daniel's disappearance had been a business mystery. A resignation. An unanswered question. Now it felt like something much larger. Ethan walked toward the office bookshelf and removed several old company history books displayed behind glass. Nobody thinks about old records, he said quietly. Everyone searches digital systems because that is where modern companies keep everything. I remembered something Daniel once told me during a late evening at the office. People protect what they can see. They forget about what they stopped looking at. At the time, I thought he was talking about forgotten employees or outdated procedures. Now I understood he had been talking about evidence. Ethan searched through the company archive section located behind the executive library. Unlike the modern digital storage rooms, this area was rarely used. It contained decades of printed reports, old financial statements, and historical documents from before Brooks Global became the corporation it was today. Dust covered some of the shelves. The room felt disconnected from the rest of the building, like a place the company had forgotten existed. After nearly 30 minutes, Ethan stopped in front of a cabinet marked with an old compliance classification number. This was removed from active records 5 years ago, he said. Why is it still here? I stepped closer. Inside the cabinet were dozens of archived folders. Most contained ordinary company history, but one folder had a handwritten label. Daniel's handwriting. My heart tightened when I saw it. Ethan opened the folder carefully. Inside were copies of financial reviews, internal notes, and printed emails. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that immediately proved wrongdoing. But together, they revealed a pattern. Different projects. Different departments. Different years. The same unusual approval changes appeared repeatedly. Ethan placed the documents across the table. He was building a timeline. I nodded. He wanted someone to understand the pattern, not just one event. We continued reviewing the pages until one document caught my attention. It was a meeting request from 8 months earlier. Daniel had requested a private discussion with several executives about financial irregularities. The meeting had been scheduled, then canceled. No explanation. No replacement date. Ethan looked at the attendee list and became completely silent. One name appeared near the bottom. Richard Halston, the chief operating officer of Brooks Global. A person respected by employees. A person who had publicly supported transparency. A person who had personally recommended moving forward with an investigation against me after the archive incident. He knew Daniel was investigating, Ethan said. I did not answer because we both understood what that meant. Someone who knew about the investigation had also helped shape the story that made me look guilty. Ethan closed the folder and took a slow breath. We need more than suspicion. I agreed. Daniel understood that too. Just then, the archive room lights flickered briefly before returning to normal. A second later, Ethan's phone received another notification. This time, there was no sender name. Only a message. You found the first piece. The second piece is already moving. Ethan looked at the screen, then at me. The question was no longer whether someone was hiding the truth. The question was how far they would go to keep it hidden. The message on Nathan Sterling's phone remained visible for only a few seconds before the screen went dark, but the meaning behind it stayed with us. You found the first piece. The second piece is already moving. I had spent months searching for answers inside Brooks Global, but I had never considered that the truth might not be waiting for us. It might be running from us. Ethan returned the phone to his pocket and looked around the forgotten archive room. The old shelves. The outdated folders. The records nobody checked anymore. Everything suddenly felt different. This was not just a storage room. It was a place someone had intentionally overlooked. If Daniel knew someone would come after these records, why leave them here? Ethan asked. I touched the edge of the folder. We had discovered. Because he knew people search for valuable things. They do not search for forgotten things. Ethan looked at me for a moment. He trusted you. The statement surprised me because it was not a question. I looked down at the documents spread across the table. Daniel trusted that someone would care enough to keep looking. For the first time, Ethan seemed to understand why I had risked everything the night before. I was not trying to protect a file. I was trying to protect the last remaining proof that Daniel had been telling the truth. We spent the next several hours carefully reviewing every document inside the archive cabinet. There were no dramatic discoveries. No single page revealing everything. The truth was hidden in the small details. A contract approved on one date, but modified later. A financial report that contained different numbers between archived versions. A project budget that changed after executive approval without any recorded explanation. Each detail looked harmless alone. Together, they created a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Ethan noticed it too. Someone was not stealing money directly, he said. They were changing information. I nodded. They were creating a version of reality that benefited them. The thought bothered him more than any missing file could have. A stolen document could be recovered. A broken system could be repaired. But when people inside a company began rewriting records, trust became much harder to restore. Ethan picked up one of Daniel's notes and read the handwriting carefully. Trust the process, not the people. He repeated the sentence quietly. He wrote this before he disappeared. I nodded. He knew the company was bigger than any individual. He believed the truth would eventually surface if the evidence survived. A notification appeared on the archive computer screen. Both of us turned immediately. The device was not connected to the company network. There was no reason anyone should have been able to access it. A single message appeared in a small window. You are not the only ones looking. Ethan stepped closer to the screen. Can you trace it? I shook my head. Not from this system. The message disappeared after 5 seconds, leaving no record behind. Ethan remained silent. Then he closed the archive folder and placed every document back exactly where we found it. We leave this room the same way we entered, he said. No one knows what we found. I understood why. Evidence was powerful only when it remained safe. Before we walked out, Ethan stopped beside the cabinet and looked back at the old records. Emily. I turned toward him. I owe you an apology. Those words surprised me more than anything else that had happened. This was Nathan Sterling, a man who managed billion-dollar decisions and rarely admitted uncertainty. For what? I asked. He looked at the folder in his hand. For believing the easiest explanation instead of asking the harder question. For the first time since the alarm had sounded, I saw something different in him. Not just authority, not just control, humility. But before I could answer, his assistant called with urgent news. The board had scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon. Someone had submitted a formal report claiming new evidence proved I had intentionally stolen company information. Ethan listened silently before ending the call. Then he looked at me. They are preparing to make you the villain before we can show the truth. I held his gaze. Then we need to find the rest of the story before they do. Ethan picked up the archive folder and walked toward the door. Behind us, the forgotten records remained untouched. But now we knew something important. The past had not disappeared. Someone had simply hidden it where nobody thought to look. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 3 hours earlier than expected, which told me everything I needed to know. People did not rush meetings unless they were afraid of losing control. Nathan Sterling and I returned to his private office with the archive folder hidden inside a plain leather case. It looked ordinary enough to anyone passing by. That was exactly why it was valuable. The most important truths were often hidden behind things nobody noticed. Ethan placed the folder inside his desk drawer and locked it before reviewing the new report his assistant had delivered. I stood near the window, watching employees move through the building below. They walked with the same confidence they always had, unaware that the company they trusted was carrying secrets beneath its polished reputation. The report says you copied confidential information for personal gain, Ethan said. I turned around slowly. Who submitted it? He looked at the final page. The compliance department. My stomach tightened. Compliance was supposed to protect the company from exactly this kind of situation. If someone had influenced that department, the problem was much larger than one executive. Ethan continued reading. They are requesting immediate termination before further investigation. I almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. They do not want an investigation. Ethan looked at me. What do they want? I met his eyes. A conclusion. The difference was simple, but it changed everything. An investigation searched for answers. A conclusion only protected a decision that had already been made. Ethan placed the report on the desk and opened the archive folder again. Inside were copies of emails Daniel had collected before leaving Brooks Global. Most were ordinary conversations about budgets, schedules, and approvals. But one message caught Ethan's attention. It was between Daniel and Richard Halston. The subject line was simple: audit concerns. Ethan opened it carefully. Daniel had written that several financial records showed unexplained modifications after final approval. Richard responded several hours later. His message was polite, professional, almost reassuring, but the meaning behind the words was different. He advised Daniel to avoid unnecessary concern and suggested that minor inconsistencies should not distract from company growth. Ethan read the message twice. He dismissed him. I nodded. And after that, Daniel stopped using company email. Ethan leaned back in his chair. He knew the system was no longer safe. Before we could continue, there was a knock at the door. Ethan quickly closed the folder. His assistant entered with another envelope. This time, there was no warning message. No anonymous sentence. Only a handwritten name on the front. Olivia Hayes. My heart skipped when I saw the handwriting. I recognized it immediately. Daniel. Ethan handed me the envelope without saying anything. Inside was a single page. Daniel had written it shortly before he disappeared from the company. Emily, if you are reading this, then the records were not enough. I wanted to believe the truth would protect itself. I was wrong. Someone inside Brooks Global has been controlling the information people receive. Trust the person who asks questions, not the person who provides easy answers. I read the final sentence several times. Do not protect the company from the truth. Protect the truth from the company. My hands tightened around the paper. Daniel had not wanted me to save Brooks Global's reputation. He wanted me to make sure the people responsible could not hide behind it. Ethan quietly asked, why did he trust you with this? I looked at the letter again. Because I was never important enough for them to notice. That answer stayed between us. The powerful people in the company had watched executives. They had watched financial officers. They had watched anyone with influence. They never expected the person organizing their schedules and managing their meetings to notice the details they ignored. Then Ethan's computer displayed a new alert. A calendar invitation had appeared without a sender. Meeting, truth verification. Location, executive conference room. Time, 10 minutes. Ethan looked at the screen, then at me. Someone wants us there. I folded Daniel's letter carefully. Or someone wants us away from here. Either way, we had reached the moment where hiding was no longer possible. The truth was no longer waiting in forgotten files. It was coming directly toward us. The executive conference room had always been a place where decisions were made quietly. Deals were approved. Strategies were created. Futures were planned. But when Nathan Sterling and I entered that room, the atmosphere felt completely different. Nobody was discussing growth or expansion. Everyone was waiting for someone to take control of the story. The board members were already seated. Around the long table, Richard Halston sat near the center, calm and composed, exactly as he had appeared in every company meeting for years. Beside him were members of the compliance department and several executives who had supported the investigation against me. For a moment, I understood why Daniel had been so careful. Power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it sat quietly at the table and waited for everyone else to follow. Ethan took his seat at the head of the room, and I sat beside him with Daniel's letter inside my folder. Nobody questioned why I was there. That alone told me Ethan had already changed the rules. Before we begin, Ethan said, we need to review information that was not included in the original report. Richard leaned back slightly. Ethan, I hope you understand the seriousness of this situation. The company cannot ignore an employee accessing restricted records. His voice was professional, controlled, almost reasonable. That was what made it difficult. He did not sound like someone hiding anything. He sounded like someone protecting the company. Ethan opened the leather folder and placed the first document on the table. Then another. Then another. The room became quieter with every page. The original financial approvals. The archived records. The hidden changes. The timeline Daniel had spent months creating. Nobody interrupted. Nobody expected the evidence to exist. These documents show repeated modifications made after approval, Ethan explained. The active database does not match the original records. One board member looked toward compliance. Why was this not discovered during the investigation? Nobody answered immediately. That silence said more than any explanation could have. Richard finally spoke. These documents require context. Old records can create confusion if they are misunderstood. Ethan looked directly at him. That is exactly why we are here. To understand them. I watched Richard carefully. For the first time, his confidence seemed slightly different. Not gone. Just interrupted. Ethan continued. Daniel Mercer raised these concerns months ago. Several executives exchanged surprised looks. The name alone changed the room. Everyone remembered Daniel. Everyone respected him. Daniel was mistaken, Richard replied calmly. He was under pressure and became overly focused on minor issues. I opened my folder and placed Daniel's handwritten letter beside the documents. He was focused enough to preserve evidence. The room went silent. Richard looked at the letter but did not touch it. That small reaction told me more than words could. He recognized it. Ethan noticed too. You know this handwriting. It was not an accusation. It was an observation. Richard remained silent for a moment before answering. Daniel was a valued employee. Of course I recognize his writing. Ethan nodded slowly. Then you also recognize why he stopped using company systems. The room changed instantly. The question was no longer about me. It was about the person who had built the argument against me. A compliance director opened her laptop and began reviewing the audit information again. There is something else, she said quietly. Everyone turned toward her. The access records from the night Emily entered the archive room. She looked confused. There is a missing security log between 11:40 and 11:47 p.m. Ethan frowned. Missing? She nodded. The system recorded the alarm. It recorded Emily's access. But there is no record showing who reviewed the archive activity before the alarm was triggered. I felt a chill of understanding. Someone had not just been watching the files. Someone had been watching the investigation itself. Ethan looked around the room. Someone wanted us focused on the person who found the problem instead of the person who created it. Nobody spoke. The truth had finally entered the room, and there was nowhere left to hide from it. Then Richard's phone received a notification. He glanced at the screen for half a second before placing it face down. Ethan noticed. Something important? Richard looked up with a calm expression. Nothing, but the timing was enough. Ethan slowly reached across the table and activated the screen displaying the final audit record. One last account appeared beside the modified files. Not Richard Halston. Not any executive. In the room, a system administrator account created years earlier and never removed. Ethan looked at the screen, then at everyone around the table. The person behind the changes had not disappeared. They had simply been hiding behind a name nobody remembered. The room remained silent after the final audit record appeared on the screen. For years, Brooks Global had trusted systems more than people. Numbers, reports, digital approvals. Everything had been designed to create confidence. But now the same systems revealed a truth nobody expected. The problem was never that information disappeared. The problem was that someone had controlled where people looked. Nathan Sterling stood at the front of the conference room, staring at the administrator account displayed beside the modified records. It was not a person. It was not an executive. It was an old system profile created during a major company upgrade years earlier. An account designed to manage technical changes. An account that should have been permanently removed. Who had access to this account? One board member asked. The compliance director quickly searched through the historical records. Her expression changed as the results appeared. Only a small group of senior administrators during the original system transition. Ethan looked at the screen. Names. She read through the list carefully. Former information technology managers. External system consultants. Current executives who approved the migration. Then she stopped. One name remained connected to the account long after the transition was completed. Richard Halston. The room changed instantly. Richard did not look angry. He did not argue. He simply looked disappointed, as if everyone else had misunderstood something obvious. You are making a mistake, he said calmly. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he opened another file from Daniel Mercer's archive. It was the final piece Daniel had hidden away. A document explaining that the old administrator account had been used to approve changes after the company migration was supposedly complete. Daniel had discovered the access months earlier. He had tried to report it. But by then, the system was already being used to create confusion throughout the company. I watched Ethan read the document silently. The man who had built his reputation on making decisions quickly was now taking his time. Because this decision was different. This was not about profit, not about strategy. It was about choosing whether the truth mattered more than protecting the image of a company he had spent his life building. Richard, Ethan finally said, why did you allow this account to remain active? Richard looked toward the window before answering. Because sometimes leadership requires difficult choices. Nobody moved. That is not an answer, Ethan replied. Richard sighed softly. You think companies survive because everyone follows rules perfectly? They survive because someone makes decisions when others cannot. I understood then. Richard did not see himself as someone destroying the company. He believed he was protecting it. But the difference between protection and control had disappeared somewhere along the way. Ethan placed Daniel's letter on the table one final time. Daniel believed the truth was more important than comfort. Richard looked at the letter and remained quiet. For once, there was no explanation that could change what the evidence showed. The investigation continued for several weeks after that meeting. Independent auditors reviewed every record. The administrator account was removed. The altered documents were restored. The company created new systems that required transparency instead of relying on trust alone. My name was cleared officially, but the apology from Brooks Global meant less to me than the moment Ethan visited my office after everything ended. He stood at the doorway without the usual confidence of a CEO entering a meeting. He looked like someone who finally understood the difference between authority and responsibility. I owe you more than an apology, he said. I smiled slightly. You believed what everyone else believed. He shook his head. That was the problem. I believed what was easiest. We stood there quietly for a moment, surrounded by the same office where I had spent years organizing his schedule and protecting confidential information. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same anymore. Ethan had learned that loyalty was not always the person who agreed with you. Sometimes loyalty was the person willing to stand alone when the truth was inconvenient. And I had learned something too. The smallest voice in the room could still change everything if someone was brave enough to listen. Months later, when people talked about the scandal at Brooks Global, they remembered the missing files, the investigation, and the executives who lost their positions. But I remembered something different. I remembered the night everyone thought I had betrayed the company. The night I was accused of stealing its secrets. Because that was the night the truth finally revealed who had really been trying to protect it all along.